What really worries me today is what's going to happen to us if machines can think. And what interests me specifically is, can they?
Well, that's a very hard question to answer. If you'd asked me that question just a few years ago, I'd have said it was very far-fetched. And today, I just have to admit I don't really know.
Well, if you're confused, Doctor, how do you think I feel?
This is AI for the Rest of Us, a podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
I'm Mark Earhart.
And I'm Casey Boyle.
This is a show that helps explain artificial intelligence, what it means, who it affects, and what you need to know right now.
I'm convinced that machines can and will think in our lifetime.
There is going to be all this automation. People are going to be out of work.
Computers are taking over now.
Here I am playing chess with a computer.
And then I just flick a switch on the modem and replace the receiver. I'm now waiting for the computer to answer me.
Today on AI for the Rest of Us.
Anything that has a lot of stats in it and data, we could probably create systems, and we will be creating systems that allow us to expand knowledge, shining a light on things that otherwise would have been completely ignored in the past.
Hey, Casey.
Hey, Mark.
We've all had the experience of reading or watching the news and thinking about who it is that's telling the story. Maybe, we might think, that journalist is coming at this from a certain angle or is being influenced by this or that thing. But how might we think about that same news story if we found out it was written by a machine?
We'll ask today's expert how much of our news is AI generated right now and how much that might change. With more and more misinformation posing as news, how can we sort out fact from fiction? And in the face of falling revenue, can AI help save the news industry?
Well, today we're talking with Robert Quigley, who teaches journalism in the Moody College of Communications at UT Austin, right here. Welcome, Robert.
Thanks. I'm really excited to be here. So to tell you a little bit about myself, I'm a professor of practice, and I'm still practicing, trying to get there, but I'll get there. I teach basically our digital journalism class. It's the intro for all freshmen. I teach a podcasting class, so hopefully I'm okay on this podcast. I'm also the director of media innovation for the Moody College of Communication, which is a position where I'm really focusing on AI right now as far as trying to make sure that we're ahead of the game, that we're meeting the right people, that we're doing the right things. And also I'm leading a peer circle, which is basically a networking event across campus. And we're basically just having discussions about AI in the classroom. So I've been thinking AI so much that I'm basically turning into ChatGPT.
We're going to challenge our listeners to tell whether you are actual human or you're an AI-generated voice.
The truth is that would be easier. I could be home watching TV and just say, let's do it.
The first time I came across generative writing even, it happened before ChatGPT and what some folks were calling narrative science. And they were using generative writing, what we would call generative writing today, to generate things like narratives based off of sports box scores or narratives based off of weather data, right? Taking tables of data, turning it into some sort of narrative, some sort of short story that as writers, and I'm sure as journalists, sports journalists, they would have to write over and over and over again and come up with a different verb for different thing, that sort of thing. And it's just increased today, right? And I'm wondering how much in 2024, how much of our news is AI generated outside of those box scores, right? And if not fully generated, partially.
That's kind of a hard question to answer, believe it or not, because when you say generated from AI, that can mean lots of things. The tools that journalists use have lots of AI features now. The tools being used to edit this podcast, I guarantee you have some AI tools. And if there's a weird humming sound in the background, you push a little button and it magically goes away. Whereas 10 years ago, we would have had to figure out how to isolate that sound and get rid of it. So journalism is a production. And as we're making stuff, there are things that are going to be AI integrated in it. Now, when you think of AI being used the way we think of AI now, where you're like, write me a good news story about this and it does it, right? That's not very common right now. I'm not sure it will be common anytime soon. Journalism is strangely kind of AI proof in that way. And I'll get more into that in a little bit. But of the communications fields, I think that for once, journalism is a little isolated from the hard disruption on that. I do think that we're seeing a big change in how we do some of the things around journalism, within a newsroom. And it's probably true in every field. So everything from a pitch to an idea generation to an email you send to your editor, all those things might have a little more kind of like AI magic behind the scenes, which also you could argue is part of the production of making a newspaper or a news website or whatever. So it's a little more complex, and it's going to get more complex as time goes on. And as our reporters go out with their smartphones to report on the news, which they do all the time, and AI is much more integrated into smartphones, then it's going to become like just ubiquitous. And we're just going to say, well, there's a lot of AI in here. Now, I do want to tell your listeners that the articles that you're reading in the New York Times, the Austin American-Statesman, Texas Tribune, wherever you're getting your news, are not AI-generated stories unless they say they are. And they're rarely ever going to do that because it's just not even good at it.
Right.
And so places have been caught doing it. I think Sports Illustrated was a famous example of it. But they got caught because it was kind of obvious.
Right.
And so I'm not worried about the writing. I'm more worried about cutting corners on certain things, but I'm also kind of optimistic because it's like a way to like dig through data.
Yeah.
It's a way to save some time on things like that. And as you said, we've been using machine learning in various ways for quite a while. Like the famous examples are, taking earnings reports and, there's thousands of those and turning those into quick little briefs, or sports. And, it's anything that's very data centric that doesn't necessarily take a human's touch. It's just more of like, you just need to know what happened out of this data. It's okay at that. I'll give you a kind of a funny example.
Yeah.
I'm a commissioner of a fantasy football league that's all statesman people. And now it's one statesman person because we've all changed jobs, over time, which is also kind of like relevant, I suppose.
Right.
And we use the CBS Sports website, and it's expensive, but they generate machine learning AI stories based on what's happening in our league. And, for years now, it's been better than any of us could have written.
Wow.
Like as far as like for that,
sure.
Because it's so data centric. It'll say like, well, Quigley lost this week, and he lost by 12 points, which is the normal amount he loses. In fact, let's go back 10 years. It's like does all the research and work, and it's like, all right, that's pretty good.
That's
right.
Great, yeah.
And so I'm not gonna be able to top that. All I can do is like talk trash. And so the AI does not talk trash. The AI is pretty good, or the machine learning in that case is pretty good at writing that kind of story.
Yeah, that's one thing I've seen as a someone who teaches writing at the college level. Generative writing isn't it's the big headline these days, but what's coming up now that I'm seeing more of is AI assisted reading, where, for instance, like you could look at a PDF with certain programs, you can turn it into a chatbot more or less. Are those the kinds of corners you're talking about being cut in terms of research and reporting?
It's definitely there. So, and I'm not, when I say corners being cut, that sounds so negative.
Of course,
I think that if a human is looking at it, making sure it did it right, and it's just saving time on something that would have been tedious, then it's not cutting corners, it's being smart. And so I'm not 100% against that. I can tell you that multiple times I've typed into ChatGPT, who is Robert Quigley at the University of Texas? And I wanted to make a bio. And it's gotten something wrong every single time until this summer. Like, until then, it was like, oh, he used to be a producer at NBC News. I'm like, no, I never did that, right? But now the last one, it was shorter, but it was accurate. Right. And so maybe it's getting a little bit better, but, hallucinations are still a thing. I know y'all have been talking about that on this podcast, and that's still a thing, but we're, the difference between journalism and what, like a lot of us out there are using ChatGPT and others for, is that journalism, when it's done well, when it's really a good, journalistic piece, requires critical thinking. It requires deciding where to play things, how to play them. What do I start with in the story? What do I do next? The AI is not good at that. It requires knowing AP style. These models have not been trained on AP style very well. And it requires going and knocking on a door and talking to somebody. And until we have like full-on androids, like sci-fi androids walking around, I think we're safe there.
Well, I'm curious. So earlier you mentioned, it sounded like maybe the risk to journalists themselves or the news industry may not be as big. It may not be as disruptive in this area as maybe some other fields. But I'm curious, like for society in general, right? For the average person just sitting out there who's really a news consumer, not a newsmaker. Are there any big risks that you see by journalists using more and more AI in their work, or even non-journalists passing off things that, we might consider news, but using AI to, say, spread misinformation or reduce the trustworthiness of news in general by cranking out newsy-looking things that aren't actually news? I mean, do you see some downsides with AI?
Yeah, I mean, we're at the absolute worst moment in history to have generative AI hit the scene.
Yeah.
Misinformation and disinformation, like intentional disinformation, has been in the news, obviously. That has been an issue now for a good 8 years or longer. disinformation from bad actors has been a problem since societies have existed, but it's just accelerating. And I think that having tools that make it this easy and keep getting better is a real problem. And I think we're going to get into a spot where people are going to say, hey, is that AI generated or not? I don't know. I'm just going to ignore it. Or people who have something that they did that was normally something that would be criticized by the media are going to say, oh, no, that was just AI generated. I didn't actually do that. And we've already seen examples of that, too.
Right.
And the water is so muddy right now that, if we weren't in this stage where misinformation and disinformation was spreading like crazy, AI would be kind of fun. Right now, I think it's kind of fun, sort of, but also a little terrifying. I will say that I taught an AI in the media class this summer, and I talked to some people who are working to solve some of those problems, including a big consortium that's doing basically provenance of content. And so if I'm an editor or producer at NBC News, which, ChatGPT seems to think I am, but if I'm a producer at NBC News and I work on a video, the software from whatever company I'm using will have integrated a way to basically encrypt that I worked on it.
Wow.
And that it wasn't AI produced. And then everybody who touches it along the way would all have like a paper trail. And Microsoft and OpenAI and Google and the BBC and a bunch of other places have all signed up on this thing. And so we're seeing like some people who are as worried about this as I am, who are actually making solutions instead of just worrying. So I'm a little hopeful on that front.
This is like blockchain for authorship.
Kind of. They're not using blockchain technology,
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but it's very similar.
And linking it through, right.
The idea is that you'll be able to say, I can verify this content is either AI or is not AI.
Right.
And I think that, like I said, there's some, gray areas there. Like I used AI tools. I think this is more like, was a human involved or not?
Right.
And like not just typing in a prompt. So
Right.
that's kind of what they're trying to do.
As a kind of follow-up question, I'm wondering if the introduction of AI and the threat of AI and the sort of specter of it, right, turns people into more critical consumers of all media.
Man, that is such a hopeful way of looking at this.
I'm just trying to. I'm trying to look for something, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I hope so, but I fear not. I think it kind of gets to the apathy thing. I think people see stuff and they're just like, oh, forget about it. I can't figure this out.
Right.
And they just like get closer to the content that they already like,
right.
which keeps us from discovering new people who could be helping us understand the world a little better. I don't think this is going to help in that area. Media literacy is a real problem, and I'm not sure that that's going to be solved by AI. I think it might be like poking a wound.
I have to think for reporters that there must be a big temptation to use AI to kind of cut corners in journalism. I'm thinking of a case that I read about recently where there was a cub reporter at a newspaper in Cody, Wyoming. After a couple of months on the job, it was discovered that he was using AI to manufacture quotes from the governor and from other officials and things in his stories. It was like another reporter at a rival newspaper had kind of noticed that something seemed off about his reporting. I'm curious, you teach students who are starting out in journalism. What kind of advice do you give them as far as where the ethical boundaries are and what's appropriate use and what isn't? Or is it just enough to tell them, look, if you get caught, here's what might happen to you. Look at these cautionary tales.
That's not enough. Yeah. No, this has been a problem since well before AI, right? So we had Jason Blair at the New York Times. It's a famous case who got caught making up quotes and sources and things like that. That's happened throughout history. If you have a chance to cut a corner, somebody's going to cut a corner, right? AI may make it a little bit easier, a little bit faster, but it's still the same concept and same process. And so ever since I started at UT back in 2011, every single class, I talk about the values that make us journalists. I talk about how the only thing we really have is our credibility. I talk about how if you kill that credibility, there's no bringing it back. You're done. And so I then point out instances where people lost their careers over it. I explain to them the proper use of all tools that come up and how to ethically use them. In my digital storytelling class, I show them how bad AI is at doing this, but then I also talk about how I tell them, and this is like almost an exact quote, I go, 20 years from now, you don't want to be like moderately successful or even wildly successful in your career and staying up at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering, did I earn that? And, I try to teach them to be good citizens and good people and ethical people. And ethics is such a part of journalism. It's one of our pillars at the Moody College is good ethics, right? And so we talk journalistic ethics on multiple levels. And so everything from being transparent about who you are, being accurate, fair, those kinds of things are all really important to journalism. And it's what separates us from like everybody with a smartphone. And so AI is like part of that. With my AI in the media class, I talked to Kelly McBride, who's a high up at the Poynter Institute, which is a journalism training institute in Florida. And her whole thing is ethics. And so she has been thinking about journalistic ethics as it relates to AI really heavily lately. I strongly encourage anybody to go look her up. If you're curious about this, she, with her team, created a template that newsrooms can use to add to their ethics policy that's AI specific. And it gives you some multiple choices, like it's okay to use it for story generation. It's not okay to use it for story generation as far as ideas, right? It's okay to use it for tools. It's not okay. And it goes through that all the way through. And it makes it kind of easy for a newsroom to kind of like at least have a good conversation about it, set some rules, those boundaries, those kinds of things. Now, when I was a journalist, more than 11 years ago, there were things that could get you fired that were ethical violations, right? And people did get fired in our newsroom. I remember some of them and I'm like, wow, that was bad. Like, why would they do that? Well, they were cutting a corner. They were being lazy, whatever it may be. Those kinds of things are still going to happen. It's just that we just need to make sure the rules are in place, that everybody understands the rules. When you go to work at a newsroom, you need to know, here's where it's okay to use AI. Here's where it's not. You're going to have people who break the rules, but that's always been true.
I want to stay on student work for a second. You led a project where students used AI to generate news stories. I think you called it the Future Press.
Yes, the Future Press.
Can you talk us through that a little bit and tell us what they learned and what lessons?
Yeah. So when ChatGPT came out, I had a really sharp student, kind of like an undergraduate TA in my class. And we were going back up to my office after class and we were like, cool, this thing came out. And we started playing around with it and we're like, whoa, it can write a journalistic story kind of, right? Yeah. And so we were doing it what everybody else did. Like, oh, make a Seinfeld script, but it's about my life or whatever. Like everybody did that kind of goofy prompt, when they first played around with ChatGPT. And it made me think like, can this really do this? And so I went to Professor Christian McDonald, who is a former colleague of mine at the Statesman and now works with me full-time on the faculty. And I said, he has an endowment. And I said, hey, do you mind using a little bit of that endowment for me to hire a couple students and play around with this AI, like in a serious way? And he was very excited about that. So I've been leading this group since then. This was January of 2023. We called it the Future Press. It's a WordPress site where we asked ChatGPT to name it. So it called itself the Future Press. And then we had it generate as much as we can. Headlines, captions, illustrations, stories, like the whole thing being 100% transparent. So every story says this is AI generated. At the bottom, we put the prompts so that people know that, this wasn't made up by some journalist. We tried various things, like we even did a relationship advice column like a newspaper would do, right? And it did really well. It was that was good. But the journalistic stories, not so much. And we did everything from like, oh, we'll generate a bunch of questions for a source. We'll tell the source what we're doing, but then we'll email them to them. These were AI generated questions. They answer them. We have the AI write the story. It took so much work by my students to edit these things. I'm telling you, it just doesn't do a good job with it. It never has, but we tried it and we tried a little bit of everything.
So as you know, Robert, the news industry is kind of beleaguered. The whole industry has gotten hammered by, losing a lot of ad revenue. And so it's just been a really tough time last, decade or more for journalism.
25 years anyway. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been a while.
Can you envision a better world for the news industry that AI can help us get there? And if so what are the ways that AI might help rebalance things?
Yeah, to put on my optimistic rose-colored glasses, I can tell you that AI is really good, or can be really good as it gets better at digging through large data sets and gleaning information from it, right? And that's such a big part of like investigative journalism. So if there's checks on it, if we're looking to see, making sure that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, I think there's some value there, and we could probably find some stories we wouldn't have found otherwise, because there are data sets out there. And I tell my students this, the government's collecting data on you from the moment you're born until the day you die, right? And some of those data sets are just untold number of rows. When you think of like your average spreadsheet, most of them won't fit on a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet because there's so many rows, right? And so being able to dig through that, come up with like ideas for stories, come up with insights for a piece of a story that might make the story much better, that might uncover something we didn't realize was even happening. I think there's real value there, and we might have some really good journalism come out of that. I also think there's definitely hope for getting some of the mundane type of things that I always say newspapers. Nobody's reading a print newspaper.
What's that?
Sorry, newspaper friends. Yeah. But news sites, there's lots of mundane things that we've done in the past. The good example is like high school sports in a metro area. There's obviously value in going to the big football matchup and telling the good story about the coach who's bringing in the winning team and someday is going to be a vice presidential candidate or whatever, right? There's always hope in that, but there's so many little things like softball and volleyball and basketball. By little, I don't mean they're not important. I mean, they're not going to normally get a staff member out there to cover it. And so as a news organization, you could say, you know what, I'm going to cover the entire United States, every single sport and if you work this out somehow, right? It's possible now, which it wasn't even possible before. And when you think of that beyond sports, like, can we do much better job reporting on climate? Can we do a much better job reporting on the economy? Anything that has a lot of stats in it and data, we could probably create systems, and we will be creating systems that allow us to expand knowledge and expand shining a light on things that otherwise would have been completely ignored in the past.
So like a force multiplier or something,
There's
like you can cover more stories.
Multiplier. Yeah, I really believe that. And I think if I were the editor of the Dallas Morning News, which has always had a reputation of covering a huge area of high schools in both sports and non-sports, I would be like doing everything I can to figure out a solution that's AI based that allows me to like go back to that glory and maybe times 10. I would love to be able to say, hey, county 5 counties away, we have the best coverage of your local school district or whatever it may be. And that's possible. And so it's just a matter of like having the resources and the technology and the time, but all that stuff's coming. And the resources and the technology and time are all like getting better and cheaper and faster. And so, I do have some hope in the force multiplier.
It feels like there's been a trend for a long time of things becoming more and more sort of nationalized in terms of the news, like producing stories that would appeal to a really broad range of people. Is this sort of going the other direction where you can make almost more personalized news or more like slicing the pie thinner for smaller audiences, I guess?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. And, we have a newspaper company here in Texas called Community Impact. If you live in, the Austin area, you probably know it because they probably threw it on your driveway at some point. It's a free weekly paper that is hyper local. And so, that construction going on down the street, like, what are they doing? Oh, they're building an Arby's. Like, you can find out through Community Impact, right? And you cannot find that out through a national organization or even, the metro organization. So they already kind of have that thinking in mind, and it's been very successful for them. And so if we could kind of recreate that at scale, where you get to like basically pop in like every single PDF that's filed with the government and it gleans through it and finds where the stories are and then tells the stories, I think we could become like way more hyper local and at a vast scale. And so, I haven't seen evidence of this happening. It's just something that's been a thought experiment. Maybe it is happening out there, but right now it's more or less a thought experiment in my head of like, what could you do with this? And that's kind of where I've been going.
Yeah, fascinating.
How should we as consumers think about news going forward, given the rise of AI?
Yeah, I think you need to, more than ever, be a good consumer of news. And by good consumer, I mean, when you read an article and it seems like it really, boy, this really satisfies my thoughts on this. And man, I really believe this. This has to be true, right? I think you need to go, okay, what are their sources? Who is this place? Are they trustworthy? Is this somebody that I've trusted in the past and I can continue to trust? Now, every news organization, every journalist makes mistakes. Are they transparent about their mistakes? Are they clear about what they did and why they did it and how they got it wrong? And I think that takes a lot of effort, right? But I think if you find a couple news organizations that satisfy your need to know local news, regional news, and national and international news, which isn't too hard, if you just kind of put a little bit of effort in, then you can say, okay, I trust these people. And once you trust those people, you kind of stay vigilant as a consumer, because if you start seeing something that's like, boy, there's no sourcing for this, like where are they getting this from? Like, hold them to account, like, write their editor and say, where'd you get the story from? Sometimes there's a good explanation, but sometimes it's like, well, our reporter was kind of lazy on that one or whatever. But generally, once you've found places that you like, I think you're good. I think a lot of the mess with the media, and you've probably seen this too, is like when you're on, I spend a lot of time on Reddit. I spend a little bit of time on X, not as much as I used to spend on Twitter. When you spend some time there's people sharing as gospel, and they're like sometimes people who were around before the internet. Right. And they're spreading as gospel something, and it's called like, the Eagles Wings Tips.net or whatever. It's like, what are you doing? Like, that can't be real. Right.
Right.
But I think people are we're set up to want to hear the choir sing. And so, my plea would be anybody who's listening to this who's trying to figure out like, how do I find out what's true or not, is like, do a little bit of homework. Yeah. Like, and don't do the homework of what do other people say. Instead, look at the content they have. Like, who are they talking to? Who are these sources? Would these sources really know? Are they correcting things publicly so you can see when they make a mistake? I think if you start doing that checklist, you could probably come up with at least a small list of news orgs that you feel pretty comfortable with.
Well, Robert, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate you joining us today. Wish we could talk for another hour.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate this, and I'd be happy to come back anytime.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's our show. Next time on AI for the Rest of Us, we have a special live episode with world-renowned tech reporter, podcaster, and book author, Kara Swisher.
We have to have a global decision-making on AI safety because it's a global issue. It's not a U.S. issue. Like, let's all decide not to have killer drones, okay? Good.
You're invited, by the way, to our next live event on October 1st, here on the UT campus. At Policy Leadership in the Age of AI, Mark will be leading a discussion about AI and energy policies with top experts. Learn more at yearofai.utexas.edu/events.
AI for the Rest of Us is a production of the University of Texas at Austin's College of Natural Sciences and College of Liberal Arts. Our show is part of the university's Year of AI. For links and more resources on today's topic, go to aifortherest.net.
Big thanks today to our guest, Robert Quigley. Our executive producers are Christine Sinatra and Dan Oppenheimer. Sound design and audio editing by Robert Scaramuccia. Our theme music is by Aiolos Rue. Our interviews are recorded by the fabulous audio engineers at the Liberal Arts ITS Recording Studio.
Thanks for listening.